Seattle was supposed to be the place where we built our lives together. But now, as I stand in the pouring rain outside the house I once called home, the weight of everything crashes down on me. My husband, Luke, just kicked me out. I never imagined that after years of struggling in silence, it would all come to this. And now, I'm in a fight not just for my freedom, but for my child. This is the story of how my life spiraled out of control, of betrayal and broken promises, and of my fight for the one thing I care about most, my child. I met Luke when I was 25, and we fell hard for each other. Seattle, with its gray skies and rain-soaked streets, was our home, and I thought we would build a life together. Luke was an architect, and he had this way of talking about the future that made me feel secure, like everything would be okay as long as we were together. We married just a year later and moved into a cozy house near Capitol Hill. Life seemed perfect on the outside. Luke worked hard, I kept up my job in marketing, and we even had our first child, Jason. But soon, things started to change. Luke's controlling tendencies began slowly. He didn't want me going out with friends as often, questioned why I'd stay late at work, and always seemed to need to know what I was doing. It seemed small at first, just things I could brush off. But it wasn't long before his temper started flaring. Whenever he was upset, it felt like walking on eggshells. If dinner wasn't ready when he got home, he'd slam the cabinets. If I didn't respond to a text fast enough, his voice would lower, simmering with anger. And it only got worse after Jason was born. He became distant and angry all the time. I thought I could fix it, that if I just worked harder, stayed quiet longer, I could keep our family together. As Luke's control over me grew, I felt more isolated than ever. My family was back on the East Coast, and I didn't have many close friends in Seattle. I felt trapped in our house, with nowhere to turn. That's when I met Evan. We worked together on the marketing campaign, and he was everything Luke wasn't: kind, attentive, understanding. It started with simple conversations over coffee during breaks, and I felt alive again in a way I hadn't in years. I never set out to have an affair, but the more I opened up to Evan, the more I realized how deeply unhappy I was. Before I knew it, our connection grew stronger. We began spending time together outside of work. It was innocent at first, just dinners, late-night conversations. But one night, everything changed. We crossed a line, and I fell into an affair that was as emotional as it was physical. I was torn. I loved Jason, and I didn't want to destroy my family. But with Luke, I felt trapped, and with Evan, I finally felt free. Then came the pregnancy. It was something I wasn't prepared for, and as soon as I saw the positive test, my heart sank. I knew that this wasn't Luke's child, and I couldn't even begin to imagine how I'd explain it to him. For weeks, I tried to keep the secret. But Luke knew something was wrong. He was already suspicious, constantly asking where I was going and who I was with. His paranoia grew as my belly did, and the tension in their house became unbearable. One evening, after I came home late from seeing Evan, Luke confronted me. His voice was low and angry, and when he demanded to know what was going on, I couldn't lie anymore. The truth came spilling out. "It's not your child, Luke." The explosion that followed was more than I ever expected. Luke's rage was like a firestorm. He grabbed me, shoved me against the wall, screaming in my face about betrayal, about how I'd ruined everything. His hands were around my arms so tightly that I thought he might break them. And then he did what I never thought he'd do: he kicked me out. He threw my things into the street and told me I was never coming back. I spent that first night in a dingy motel, trying to process everything that had just happened. I had no family nearby, no real friends I could confide in, and nowhere to go. I called Evan, but there wasn't much he could do. Luke had made one thing clear: he was keeping Jason. Luke claimed I was unfit, that I had destroyed our marriage, and that I wasn't capable of being the mother anymore. And in his anger, he told me he'd make sure I never saw my child again. Those first few weeks after being kicked out were a blur. I rented a tiny apartment downtown, near Pike Place Market, but it felt more like a prison than a fresh start. Every day, I called Luke, begging him to let me see Jason. But he refused. He blocked my number, shut me out entirely. My life had turned into a nightmare, and I had no idea how to fix it. Eventually, I knew I had to fight. I couldn't let Luke take Jason from me, and I wasn't going to let him use my mistakes to keep my son from me. I hired a lawyer and started the grueling process of fighting for custody. Luke, of course, didn't make it easy. He hired a best lawyer in Seattle and came at me with everything he had. He painted me as an unfit mother, told the court that I'd abandoned Jason, and used the affair to destroy my character. But I had my own weapons. My lawyer gathered evidence of Luke's abuse, photos of the bruises he'd left on my arms, testimonies from the neighbors who'd heard him yelling at me late at night. We built a case that showed who Luke really was, a controlling, violent man who shouldn't have custody of our child. It was a war in that courtroom. Every day felt like a new battle, and with each hearing, I grew more and more exhausted. But I refused to give up. Jason was my son, and I wasn't going to let Luke win. As the custody battle dragged on, Luke became more dangerous. He'd show up at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door, demanding to see me. He followed me when I left work, hovering just out of sight, always watching, always lurking. I was terrified. My lawyer helped me file for a restraining order, but it didn't stop Luke. I'd see him in the shadows on the streets of Seattle, always there, always waiting for his chance. And then one night, everything came to a head. I was walking home from work late, as the city's lights flickered against the rain-soaked streets. I hadn't seen Luke in over a week, and I thought maybe he had finally backed off. But as I rounded the corner to my apartment building, I saw him standing there. He looked furious, more unhinged than I'd ever seen him. Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing my arm and yelling in my face. He screamed about how I'd destroyed his life, how I was an unfit mother, how he'd make sure I never saw Jason again. He pinned me against the wall, his hands around my throat, and for a moment, I thought he was going to kill me. But then a bystander stepped in, pulling Luke off of me just in time. The police were called, and Luke was arrested for violating the restraining order. That night, I realized just how close I'd come to losing everything. After months of fighting, the court finally ruled in my favor. I was granted partial custody of Jason. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was enough. I could finally see my son again, hold him, be his mother. Luke didn't take it well, of course. He's still fighting me, still trying to use every legal trick in the book to keep Jason away from me. But I'm not giving up. I've come too far, fought too hard, to let him win now. Life after the storm is quieter now. The rain that once felt oppressive now feels like a sign of renewal. I've started to rebuild my life, slowly but surely. Evan is still in the picture, and though things are complicated, we're trying to build something together. Jason is the center of my world, and every moment I spend with him reminds me why I fought so hard. As for Luke, he's still lurking in the background, but I don't live in fear anymore. I found my strength again. I'm not the woman Luke tried to break. I'm stronger now, and no matter what he tries to do, I know one thing: I will never stop fighting for my child, for love, and for the life we deserve. Seattle may be known for its rain, but for me, it's where I found my strength again. I'm no longer afraid of the storm. I've learned how to dance in the rain.